Great, welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Jerry Lynn Hogg, and I'm the director of the Media Psychology program at Fielding Graduate University, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And it's my pleasure to be able to introduce this panel. I've been fortunate enough to be able to work with several of the panelists. One of the interesting phenomena of the pandemic is so many people, youths and adults alike, have turned to video games. I actually just, when someone heard about the conference, she wanted to share with me that she had done some video games with her husband, and they were all the very sort of collaborative community type, and I'm sure this panel will talk a little bit about that. But the panelists will consider topics related to how gaming fits into adjustments to social distancing and lockdown, and whether there's any concerns for parents or gaming. The panel is moderated by Dr. Chris Ferguson. He's a professor of psychology at Stetson University. Joining Dr. Ferguson today is Rachel Cowart, and Dr. Rachel Cowart is the research director of Take This. Dr. Linda Kay, and she is a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Edge Hill University. And finally, Dr. Mark Smith, who's the president of the Psychological Society for Ireland. Following the presentation, there will also be a question and answer period where you'll be able to post questions you might have in the chat. And we ask that you be respectful and refrain from any comments or actions that might be seen as bullying, discriminatory, harassment, or that display inappropriate content. Anyone not respecting this code of conduct will be removed from the meeting. We want this to be a positive experience for all involved, and so thank you for your help in understanding this. I also want to give a shout out, much appreciation to our PhD student, Rachel Valdez, for providing behind the scenes backup for today's presentation. And so now I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Ferguson.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. So yeah, thank you all for coming. We're gonna be talking a little bit about video games and how that's related to everything that's kind of going on in the world right now. And so what we're going to do, kind of like the timeline, is I'm going to give our panelists a couple minutes to introduce themselves, maybe about 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about themselves. And then one of our panelists was not able to make it, just one of these herding cats kind of things, and his timeline didn't work out for him. So he was gracious enough to put together about a 6-minute video. So I'm just going to run that video and hope that technology works. It worked 3 minutes ago when we tested it, so hopefully it'll work again when we actually try to use it. We'll play his video, hopefully everybody can see and hear it, and then we'll get to the regular session. So what we're going to do is it's actually going to be pretty informal for the most part, in the sense of, unlike, we're not going to have like PowerPoint slides and this kind of stuff. What's going to happen is I'm basically going to function as the moderator, and I'm going to throw some questions out to our esteemed panelists, and people can talk about what they think of the question, so hopefully we have some, we don't have to have consensus, we can have disagreements. If people throw virtual tomatoes at each other, I think that'd be more fun. So we'll do that until we run out of time, and then hopefully you all as attendees will have questions for us, and we can try to answer them. That having been said, I'm pretty open to things being fairly casual, so I think if you guys being the attendees want to post questions in the chat, I think that's how it's working. I think Rachel Valdez will, Rachel can interrupt us and let us know there's a question pending, and we can just, start dealing with audience questions when they come through. I'm pretty open to kind of being flexible. If you're not familiar, this is kind of how they do things at like the cons, like, Comic-Con and PAX and this kind of stuff. So we're kind of making it a little bit more similar to that than to a typical academic conference. So let's go to introductions. Again, I'm Chris Ferguson, professor of psychology at Stetson University, study video games a lot. I think that's pretty much, I live in Florida. I don't know what else you want to know about me, so that probably much does it. So I'm going to go from me, what looks to me to be clockwise. So for me, that would be Rachel Cowart would be next.
Hi, I am Dr. Rachel Cowart. I am the research director of Take This, which is the first mental health nonprofit to form serving the gaming industry and gaming community specifically. I have studied games and gamers for more than 10 years. I've published several books on it, including The Video Game Debate and A Parent's Guide to Video Games. And I'm ready to talk about Animal Crossing because this is a this is a panel about the pandemic, right? I feel like that's going to come up. So yeah, that's me.
All right, cool. All right, on my screen at least, Linda is next.
Hiya, I'm Dr. Linda Kay, and I've been studying video games now for about 13 years. My PhD was on why people play games, what they experience and how they're affected by them. And since then, I've looked a lot more about the social aspects of gaming. So how games brings us together, how it helps us connect, what we experience when we're playing socially. And how all those kind of things are important for well-being. And in fact, I've collaborated with Rachel on projects on these things. We have very similar sort of approaches to our research. So I'm really excited about chatting with everybody on this panel today and hearing questions from you guys. So looking forward to the discussion.
All right, very cool. And last but not least is Mark Smythe.
Hi, I'm Mark Smith. I'm the current president of the Psychological Society of Ireland, and in my day job, I'm a chartered clinical psychologist working in a child and adolescent mental health service. So, and also a former gamer, quite a big gamer until I had 3 children who decided that daddy didn't have time to play games anymore. But I suppose in my clinical work, it comes up a lot in terms of finding ways of engaging young people, and in working with teenagers, analogies works quite well. So with a teenage boy, trying to find an analogy from Call of Duty that fits with his problem solving or to help him in terms of motivation can be good. I'm also quite a strong proponent, usually robbing research from the likes of Chris, Linda, Rachel, and Andrew Srievsky and Amy Orban on Twitter to challenge, I suppose, the moral panics. I think we'll probably get into that as we have in Chris and Pat Markey's book. In trying to educate the public that sometimes what you see on social media and the papers is not what it seems.
Mm-hmm. Twitter is the root of all evil. I think that's probably the theme for today.
That's so much fun. So much fun.
I know I love Twitter, but yeah.
All right, so the next thing before we get into the actual moderated questions and going back and forth, as I mentioned, Pete Etchells, who is a professor of psychology at Bath Spa University. He was not able to be here today. He's probably got other, I don't know, he's probably got kids that are running around, I don't know what, but he's got other stuff he had to do, so he couldn't make it. And so what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to try to share my screen and get this video to play. So bear with me. Just because we do research on technology doesn't mean we're good at it. So hopefully this will work okay. So sharing screen. Where's this video? There it is. Okay, hopefully you all are seeing Pete Etchells. Okay, I see some nods from the panelists at least, and I will play.
We are.
My name's Pete Etchells. I'm a professor of psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University in the UK. I'm sorry I can't be there at the symposium today. The timings didn't just work out for me, but technically nobody can be there, so I guess it's all good. I do research on video games. Historically, I've done work on the effects of violent video games on behavior. I also have an interest in screen time as well, and its mental health and well-being effects on adolescents and adults. And I'm more interested more recently in the context of things like loot boxes. So whether gambling-like mechanisms in games or things that maybe look a little bit like gambling are in fact that, and do they result in any problematic behaviours that we can identify in various sorts of populations. The symposium today is on gaming during the plague, and I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about at the minute, because from my point of view, particularly the narrative around video games, the public narrative, really seems to have shifted since we went into quarantine. For the past 5 years, 10 years that I've been doing stuff in this sort of area, it really has felt like there's been an uphill battle in terms of how you talk about the effects of video games and the impact of them in public spheres. You know, for a long time, it felt like every so often a paper would come out or a story would come out claiming that video games are melting kids' brains or causing early onset dementia, or they're just terrible for us in some other way. And what I was trying to do for a very constant period of time was push back against that and say, well, look, the evidence doesn't necessarily suggest that. This is a really nuanced, complex area, and we don't really have a good way of testing some of these effects yet. And that's probably still true to a certain extent. What seemed to happen, though, is that overnight the screens won effectively. So we were put into this situation where we weren't able to go out and talk to people and have those more traditional, what feels like more naturalistic face-to-face conversations with people. We had to find other ways to interact. And suddenly I think people started realizing that video games are not this socially isolating experience that they're often made out to be. And I think a lot of us, and probably everybody on this panel today, has been thinking this for a long time, that games have never been socially isolating. Fundamentally, they are there to bring people together. Now more than ever, I think, especially with the advent of high-speed internet, where you can play really fast, really high-quality games with other people around the world at the same time, they have this potential to bring together communities of people, like-minded people, all who share a common interest, so that they can enhance their social interactions and play with each other and just enjoy their time together. And I think people are starting to realize that a little bit more now. So that's a nice thing from a public engagement perspective, because it's starting to feel as though people are getting more of a nuanced appreciation of how video games can have positive impacts on us, as well as potential negative impacts. It's a weird one in a sense, in that this all comes in the context of the World Health Organization about a year or so ago, classifying gaming disorder as an officially classifiable, diagnosable disorder for the first time in ICD-11. And at the time, there was a big debate in the literature. There still is a big debate about whether this is the right approach to take or not. There's a camp of researchers that suggests that this is a good thing to include, because it will capture people who are having real difficulties with video games and hopefully allow them access to treatment or to financial support to support treatment or insurance and things like that. There's another group of researchers that I count myself in, I think other members of the panel do as well, that argue that this is perhaps a little bit too premature to include this sort of diagnosis category. And I think the main reason for that, or one of the main reasons, is that we don't really have a good handle on what gaming disorder is yet. We don't really know what the prevalence rate is in the gaming population. We don't really have a good handle on how to classify it and diagnose it differentially. So how do we separate it out from other forms of impulse control disorders, say, or other disorders that share similarities but aren't quite the same? So in other words, is there anything unique about gaming disorder that we're missing? And if that's the case, it may be likely either that we end up overdiagnosing, so a lot of people who are highly engaged with video games but don't actually show any sorts of problems might end up getting diagnosed with a disorder they don't have, or conversely, we end up missing the people who we really need to help. So it's interesting that we were having this conversation around gaming disorder, and then it was really kind of put under the test effectively when we went into lockdown. And actually the World Health Organization seemed to change tack a little bit. So going from claiming that gaming disorder is a thing about a year ago to actively encouraging people to play video games during lockdown as a really good way of staying apart, staying physically isolated, but not socially isolated. So one of my hopes really is that if we can take anything positive out of the pandemic, is that there's a new appreciation for needing to do good research on video games in terms of the real complexities and the real nuances around the sorts of effects they might have. And considering both the positives and the negatives at the same time, video games, like anything, they're not all good or all bad. Where their true effects lie is in that kind of grey area in the middle. It depends on who you are, what you're doing, what games you're playing, who you're playing them with, what your past is like, what your current situation is like. And having a new appreciation for that, and maybe getting away from some of the rhetoric around video games being all good or all bad, would be a really good thing. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium, and I'll look forward to seeing it online later.
All right. All right, so we should be back to regular mode. Everybody can see the panel again. I'm try not to assume that what I see is what everybody sees. Okay. So yeah, so I thought that was great. So I'd like to start with our esteemed panel, kind of taking off from something Pete was saying in there. And one of the points he was making, and this is sort of anecdotally was my impression as well, is that there was a sense of, there was this societal unease perhaps around video games that's been probably decades long. And then COVID happened, and then suddenly everybody loves games. And it seemed like, it did seem like, at least the news media coverage, it was a pretty significant and fairly sudden shift, I think, in the positivity ratio, at least, of coverage of that. So, my question then to start, for the panel is this going to be like a long-term trend? Is this really is demonstrating a shift in the way that society is thinking about video games, or is going to think about video games? And where do things go from here? Did COVID rescue video games, I guess, is kind of what I'm suggesting.
I mean, that would be nice. I agree that the tone has shifted, and I would love to be hopeful that this is a sign finally recognizing the positive sides of games. I feel like all of us here on the panel have been chipping away at the mountain of games can be good for an exceedingly long amount of time, with little recognition from the general public or from the news media that games can have positive impacts in people's lives. But that said, 3-4 months into the pandemic, I have to say I am already seeing the shift kind of turning back towards, oh, now it's too many video games. Now what else can I do with my children while they're still in quarantine? So I am hopeful, but not convinced, I think.
I think I have similar sentiments, I think, and certainly I've seen, as Pete's quite nicely illustrated, that shift was so quick. I'm very hyper aware of it, having lots of interview requests and so on, and that was great to see. But I think there's a fickleness, and people, a lot of media is very fickle on turning with the times, and I do worry that actually the tide could turn back again very quickly. So yeah, I think I agree with Rachel on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar. I think it's a good start, and certainly it's a positive change, but I think it's a trickle compared to the tidal wave of negative media that's been there. It's certainly a good start, but I don't think in terms of the volume of positive coverage that it is enough to change a populist view on it yet, because we still have, and we're always going to have those I suppose Helen Lovejoy type tendencies who will shout, "Will somebody please think of the children?" and shout all over social media about it without seeing the kind of hypocrisy of it. So those people are there. They haven't gone away, and I think the first opportunity for some kind of headline to come out to link gaming or excessive gaming with alleged, I think the phrase I keep saying is tsunami of mental health problems. I think it'll be jumped all over it. So I think we can't take our foot off the pedal yet. It's a good start, but we've a long way to go.
Okay.
Although I do think actually one thing that might have happened is people who may not otherwise have been that active in playing games have been encouraged to participate, and actually that from a public understanding, maybe there's more exposure of the benefits it brings. So even if media exposure starts to turn, possibly I'd like to think that actually public exposure and experience in being more involved in the activity actually might turn a more broad public perception about the benefits. I say that with great optimism, but I think that's something maybe to ponder as well.
Yeah,
I tend to agree, because this is one of the facets of lockdown, is that parents and kids were cooped up in the house for weeks and months on end together, and parents can get bored too. So when they see their kids playing games, this natural curiosity of, oh, what's that? Let's have a closer look, and maybe realizing there's more to it than they gave them credit for, and in some cases participating with them and learning, which is what I've been certainly encouraging parents to do for years, is get in and play it with them, look at them, show interest, show curiosity. And that makes kids want to talk to you about it more. So it fosters a better relationship.
Yeah. And I did say I was going to mention Animal Crossing, but my mother, who is late 60s, started playing Animal Crossing in the pandemic as a way to connect with her grandchildren. They can visit each other's villages. And if that's not an endorsement of anyone could play games, it's that. Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things too that we see in like even surveys, right? Is that going on Linda's point is that experience with games is pretty strongly. I know everybody says every correlation is strong, but like even compared to other correlations, there's a strong correlation between sort of experience with games, which itself is kind of associated with age, as you're kind of referring to, Rachel, there with your grandmother, but and attitudes towards games. So people that play games more have more positive attitudes. People that play games less have more negative attitudes. And you see this even with clinicians and even with researchers who study video games, which is fascinating, you know, to me. So there's no like immunity to that effect by knowing more things. You would think like researchers would be more data-based, but age or experience with games still seems to be a thing. So that, I kind of wondered about that is a sense of, as people are sort of forced to try video games, like your grandmother, Rachel, you know, does that create this sort of like, as someone said, populist sort of like trend towards being more positive? There are weird political things. I don't know if this happened in the UK or Ireland, if there's any kind of comparison, but I know like the violent video game debate, you know, which has historically been bipartisan in the US, suddenly became a Republican issue as soon as Trump used it to blame. So all of a sudden, everybody on the left didn't think violent video games cause aggression anymore. And I don't know, even though I think
It does.
that's right, it does. I think that's a positive.
Yeah.
I think that's a positive change, but
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a positive change for the right reason necessarily.
Yeah.
You know, was that an informed opinion or is it I hate Trump opinion? You know, I can understand perhaps, but you know, anyway. So I was just kind of curious about you know, some of that sort of stuff. But we'll get to Animal Crossing in a little bit. I've never played Animal Crossing, and so I'm going to ask why people do in a little bit. But so, and I guess it's getting, I think, Mark, you mentioned something about this, about parents, you know, gradually now starting to think too much is going on with the game. So what advice should we give, or do you have, however we kind of phrase that, how do you balance screen time or video games during lockdowns, you know, where kids are not having as much in terms of like face-to-face interactions? They're probably on virtual school. I don't know how it's looking in the UK or Ireland. You know, in Florida, we're seen to be developing a weird hybrid model of we don't know where our kids are going to be on any given day. We'll just assume they come home for dinner. And hope for the best. But what kind of advice? You know, there used to be this idea of like the AAP, American Academy of Pediatrics, said 2 hours was like the maximum. They eventually dropped that, thankfully. But the rules have changed now, right? I mean, how do you say what is too much when kids don't have as many other things to do? They can't go hang out face to face with their friends or spend time with their grandmother or things like that. So how do we balance screen time? I'd like to know, because I have a 17-year-old son. So how much is too much for my kid in terms of screen time and video games and all of that? How do we know? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think we've had to be a little bit more kind of compassionate and empathetic towards the amount of time that kids are engaging in screen time during the lockdown, because of the impact of isolation on all of us, but them in particular. But I think, and there's also, I suppose, the reality that for many parents, they've had to try and work from home or do, you know, symposia like this while the kids are downstairs and hoping they're not burning the house down. So there's a reality that everyone has had to make some compromises. And it's interesting, because at times I've been accused of being a media and screen time and gaming apologist. But yet when I give talks to parents, one of the core things that I will always emphasize is about getting balance and boundaries. I don't think that has changed because of the pandemic, because the pandemic will end and it will come to it. And if a young person has become perhaps overly reliant on gaming during that without those boundaries, we're going to have to try and get them to transition back. And there's going to be some difficulties around that. I think that they will have to rein that in, that, you know, even if they couldn't go to mix with their friends, it's about the content and how they're using it as well as the length of time. So yeah, they may be playing a single player Call of Duty for an hour or two, but then it's important to do a FaceTime call to grandparents and connect socially, to go out and play in the garden, to go for a walk, to get enough sleep. That if you get those basic things right, that, you know, that you don't allow your kids to skip meals, to skip dinner time because they're in the middle of a game, you got to keep those basic boundaries in place.
It's just like pre-pandemic times, everything in moderation. Go into the garden, clean your room, help me bake a cake. A lot of baking during COVID-19 in my house. It's science, right? And reading, so it's fine. But I think what you said, Mark, was a really important point about the use that the games are serving. Are they playing Animal Crossing with their friends and chatting? Okay, that's a social interaction. They're not playing games to waste time. It's not something like frivolous. This is their social time. Are they playing Call of Duty for a stress release? Games are natural stress relieving. Playing it releases endorphins. It makes our mood better when we're in a bad mood. So I think giving our children a little bit more grace and flexibility, but also doing other things.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the question about how much is too much, I think, you know, it's more about what are the different uses of screens, and this is where it's balancing out what the different affordances that screens are doing. And this sort of maps onto what Mark and Rachel sort of alluded to, really, is, you know, rather than talk about screen time as a kind of universal, kind of unitary sort of thing, I mean, there's general agreement from you know, scholars in this area that it's a meaningless thing to be talking about, really, as a concept, because our screens, you know, function for our everyday experiences. They serve important functions: entertainment functions, social functions, educational functions, work functions, etc., etc. So understanding the balance of the uses and the affordances of that is a more meaningful thing to look at rather than time per se.
Yeah, very cool. All right, I think Rachel Valdez let us know we have a couple questions from the audience. So the first one I see is from Holly Bevan, and it is, I am not a gamer, but fascinated by its power in the positive psychology and bias reduction space. Are there any companies or games that focus on incorporating psychological principles? I'm guessing related to those issues.
I don't know about specifically related to those issues. There are a lot of games now. There is kind of a forward trend over the last 4 or 5 years to make games specifically addressing psychological components or issues. For example, at Take This, we have an award. It's called the Dr. Mark Award, and we've given it biannually to games that are designed for hopeful and accurate representations of mental health. This year, the award went to Celeste, I think. Oh no, I gave the award. I should remember. I think it went to Celeste. But there is a trend for these games being developed now, and it's something I think we're going to see even more of in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Sorry, go on, Mark.
No, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, and definitely there's a huge move for games for good, and again, games that actually are developed to promote people to do acts of good and to share kind words and things like that. So yeah, I'd absolutely agree. There's a real opportunity and market there already that is becoming more and more popular. So absolutely.
In Ireland, in UCD, University College Dublin, we've had colleagues who developed a game called Pesky Gnats, and it's an interactive game designed around CBT principles. So it's around assisting young people who might be struggling with problem solving, depression, anxiety, to find a unique way of engaging them in the world that they know, but get psychological principles across to them so that it's embedded within a context that's both familiar and interesting to them. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
The question also reminded me, in a little bit of a different take, of Paul Adachi's work, which is on just like regular games. But he finds that playing essentially like shooter games, that people that are it's also kind of, I think, applies to some of our larger issues now with like race and differences and this kind of stuff. But he finds that like players that come from different social backgrounds, when they play together in shooter games cooperatively, tend to have more positive views of each other as a consequence of you know, sort of sharing that space together. So which I think is very, very intriguing, and I think, you know, again, very, very relevant to some of the larger societal discussions we're having today about bringing people together, perhaps better than we have in the past. So I think that's maybe also relevant to Holly's question. And by the way, I encourage the attendees, if we didn't actually answer your question, to put an angry emoji in the chat.
We'll try again.
Yeah, we'll try again. Yeah. We just sort of elided past it or whatever. Yeah. I'm not going to answer that question, but here's a question I'm going to answer, you know, sort of thing. Another question is from, and also if I skip over a question, it's entirely possible I may do that. You can send another angry emoji and tell me to look back up where your question actually is. But I have a question from Josh Cohen that is self-determination theory, competence, relatedness, and autonomy the best theoretical model to explain the positive benefits of video games, and is there a better one? Now I could say, if Andy Shabilsky had been on the panel,
He would say
yes and no. But I'll throw that to the, if you don't know Andy, he's a big proponent of self-determination theory, and he studies video games. But I'll go ahead and throw that to the panel. What do y'all think about self-determination theory?
I am a fan. I think it's great for explaining engagement. I don't know if it is the single best way to explain positive mental health outcomes from playing, but it's definitely my go-to model when I talk about player engagement and enjoyment of playing games.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking a lot more at self-determination theory in games recently, actually, just for some recent work I've been doing, and definitely it's an all-encompassing and very useful theory. I do think there are other theories though. One I go to a lot is when thinking about the social aspects of social identity theory, and that always seems across different contexts, not just gaming, just always seems to work. And it explains a lot about gamer identity, community, and how that functions positively for well-being. So I always see that one when you're thinking about the social connectedness in gaming. That one's always quite a nice one as well. But either of those two theories, I think, are solid from my perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everybody.
Why would Andy say no? That's what I want to know. Why do you think Andy would say no?
Oh, I think he would say no to if there are any better theories. I was kidding. I don't know.
That's funny. I would also like to say mood management theory is one I also go to.
Mood management theories you get to. I mean, although they're compatible. If you're not familiar with, yeah. I mean, do you want to explain mood management theory, Rachel?
Well, you play games. So people engage in media and entertainment to change their mood state. So if you're bored, you might watch a very high action movie, or if you're sad, you might watch a happy movie to manage the negative moods into more positive moods. Was that a good definition? Maybe you can do it better.
Fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Pretty straightforward for the most part. Yeah, thank you. So we have a question about violence in video games. Before I get to that one, I wanted to ask a related question that I had. I'm going to briefly share my media again and show you a little graph I have. If it works, it didn't work. Okay, what happened here? Share. There we go. So related to violence in video games, I have this little graph here, which is a very primitive thing. So it's just a Google Trends thing. So it's just like looking at Google searches for violence in video games for the regular people, just people. This was people like searching for the topic. And as you can kind of see from this graph, there is a declining trend with lots of peaks and valleys, but nonetheless a declining trend in terms of searches for the topic of violence in video games. So I actually kind of wanted to ask first, and then I'll get to the question one of the attendees had. So that what do you make of that graph? I mean, are people getting less interested in the topic of violence in video games over time? Again, with those little peaks, I'm guessing the peaks are probably a shooting happened or something of that sort that is increasing interest short term. Is this there's this like theory of moral panics, right? That like comic books and rock music in the 80s, eventually people get tired of blaming Ozzy Osbourne for suicide or whatever else it might be, So is this starting to happen with violence in video games, do you think?
I think, Chris, I think it is, but I think, unfortunately, and it's sad to say this, but the inevitability of when there is another mass shooting somewhere, that the media in particular will revert back to type. And I think my worry is that they will look at the pandemic and perhaps the increase in kids playing games and draw their own, I think, kind of lazy, stereotypical conclusions that kids were in lockdown, kids played lots of games, there's another shooting, 2 and 2 equals 7. And I think that they ignore the factors that we know that do cause real world violence, but the general public like simple answers to complex questions because logically it makes sense to them, and they need a bet and war to blame rather than look at the societal issues that we know are linked to violence, such as poverty, domestic violence, or access to weaponry. So I think there's a pause on it, but I think depending on when the next tragedy happens, we might see that shift back.
Okay. Other thoughts from Rachel or Linda?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see the shift back. I think just like it was a very long time, and even still now, about violent movies or violent television, we still have those discussions. Games are even more intense because they're interactive. That's always like the go-to argument. I don't see it going anywhere until VR is popular, and then that becomes the main area of interest. And maybe we'll stop talking about video games and be talking about that.
Well, it'll just be VR video games at that point. Right?
Well, yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me get to the question here. I'm trying to take the questions as in the order they come in, by the way, which is actually probably a bad moderator. Good moderators take the questions they like and ignore all the other questions, right? I'm trying to just to get them in order. The next question I have is from Anna Marie. I think part of the last name is blocked off there. I can't quite see the full last name. Pearson or something like that. I apologize. I know I'm messing up your last name. I just can't quite see it all on the chat. And her question is, I am very much in favor of new games for change and gaming for good, but still wonder about a very traditional media issue, the violent content and narrative and interaction with it that gaming poses. I think it is so important for parents and teachers to directly address this imagery and its meaning with students. How do we reconcile shooting prostitutes, these are, I think Grand Theft Auto references here, or picking off pedestrians against a backdrop to look almost exactly like in real life spaces, a la Brooklyn or LA's digital arts district, she mentions in game and Grand Theft Auto 4 and 5 respectively. So what do people's thoughts about that?
I feel like you are well versed to answer this question.
Am I allowed as a moderator to answer questions?
I think that you should. This is your area.
I think you should.
Well,
Just
yeah.
be repeating your research if I answer it. So go on.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, honestly, this is an area that people have been debating. I mean, if you really kind of look historically, people have been debating this general topic for like literally 2,500 years. I mean, you can go back to the ancient Greeks, where the Athenians in particular. I don't think the Spartans cared. You know, this has been an issue that's been around for a long time, and it will be, I think, for a long time. You know, and so you'll get very different opinions on this depending upon who you ask about this, and it still is intensely debated. You know, my view of it is, of course, some of these games are developed with adults in mind. You know, and obviously the games have ratings. You know, Europe has PEGI. England has the British Board of Film Classification, I think specifically, and then of course the U.S. has. Oh God, I'm blanking on it.
ESRB.
ESRG, thank you. Oh my God, I can remember the European and British one. I can't remember the American one, which is weird. So I think, yeah, I mean, parents have the right to be informed of the content. I mean, I played Grand Theft Auto 5. It's the only one of the Grand Theft Auto games I've ever played. I mean, it was okay. It wasn't like my go-to game. It's made for adults, you know, and I think it's right there in the title, you know, it's a felony in the title. So there's no mystery, I think, for the most part. In terms of its impact, you know, so what do I think the question mentioned teachers. What do teachers do? I don't know that there's much for them to do other than encouraging parents to, you know, read game reviews, look at the box, look at the ratings, know what they're buying for their kids. In terms of actual impact, my impression is there does not appear to be evidence that satisfies me that playing these games, even at younger ages, is associated with aggression, or certainly not violent crime or mental health problems or things like that. Now, as Pete mentioned in his video, you may get some sort of idiosyncratic effects that, you know, every parent knows their child better than I do, or the panelists do, or the APA does. So there may be some kids that find GTA cathartic and they actually become less aggressive. And there may be some who, for whatever reason, it does accelerate whatever aggressive tendencies they have, you know. So every parent kind of has to know their own kid. But on the aggregate level, in terms of like impact on society, these games don't really seem to have much impact in terms of like increasing aggression in the aggregate in society. In fact, if you look at like Patrick Markey's work, he kind of suggests the opposite, that, you know, at least in short-term bursts, when these games come out, they tend to pull most young males off the streets. I'm kind of putting it bluntly, and into their living rooms, and that actually decreases crime. There's a criminology theory called routine activities theory that kind of explains why that is. But you know, so I think the worst thing that parents or teachers could do, or the APA could do, or psychologists do, is exaggerate. Like this thing's, as I think Pete, or maybe it was Mark, you might have said the quote of like melting people's brains and that kind of stuff. You don't want to exaggerate this, because then that actually harms the reputation of the APA, of teachers, or whoever it is, when their teenagers look up the evidence and say like, but look, mom, here's a science paper that conflicts with what my teacher said. So you have to be careful, and you can express concern, but you have to be cautious and honest about the data when that data doesn't necessarily support a particular narrative one way or the other. So I hope that helped. other thoughts from, that's the 50 Cent version.
Yeah, I think as well, you know, when you're talking about things like GTA, you know, a lot of it is thinking about to what extent a player is actually engaging morally with the acts that are being undertaken. So, you know, these, to some extent, it's not just the actual behaviour of a game, it's about to what extent is somebody actually morally engaged or disengaged with that. And actually, that's a more important question. You know, if you understand that the act that you're doing is taboo, but it's okay in a game, but it's not in real life, that's actually the most important point really that could come from that, in terms of what the kind of harmful effects might be, you know, subsequent to that. So I think the morality issue with things like that is important to think about as well.
Yeah. I think Matt Grizzard actually has a few studies that suggest that playing as like Grand Theft Auto actually increases moral reflection or something of that sort, which suggests that even playing those games, and this I think was with young adults in fairness, you know, but I think actually suggests some positive impacts from, you know, people do bad. I mean, I play Grand Theft Auto 5, so I can kind of understand it in the sense of like, ooh, that was, you know, there's some parts of it that are like, wow, I would really not want to do that in real life. And the narrative about like killing prostitutes, that is actually a very, very small part of the game. I think, you know, people might do it to be novel like a couple times and realize it's not that much fun actually. And, you know, so there are narratives in the game nonetheless that, you know, still make you do dark things sometimes, usually not involving those kind of like stereotypical, you know, impressions of what's in the game. But, and I think that goes to the next question as well, which is by Carlos. I think it's, again, your name is cut off a little bit. I apologize. Carlos Lende, and I'm guessing it might be Gonzalez at the end, but I apologize if I got your name wrong. What is your opinion about war simulation world domination games? They're awesome. And do you think, and I'm being facetious, but do you think they can promote narcissistic manipulative attitudes by reducing lives to cannon fodder? Now, I did say that because I love playing Civilization, and this is probably a group of games I enjoy playing a lot, and Europa Universalis. Again, I think for me, the answer is kind of the same. There doesn't really seem to be much evidence that playing the game shifts personality or attitudes very much, if at all. I know looking at, again, more like militaristic games, Torsten Quandt has done some stuff. And Rachel, I don't know, you might have been on that one.
I wasn't on it, but I was around when that was happening.
You know that one was happening. We're basically saying that playing these kind of games did not impact people's attitudes towards the military or things like that. So again, I think the answer there is probably pretty similar. That you know,
I mean, of the research I've seen in terms of long-term attitude change from playing games, the only research I've seen that shows any kind of significant change in attitudes are from serious games that are specifically developed to change your attitudes, things like Papers, Please, and games like that. But I haven't seen anything from, you know, big blockbuster games that are not designed specifically to make you think and reflect upon your thoughts and attitudes to have any kind of significant long-term attitude change.
I think it also underestimates the ability of young people to differentiate between real world and virtual. You know, they've grown up with this world. They know that there's a difference between them, and it can be quite invalidating for a young person for us to assume automatically that they can't tell the difference, whereas most of them can, and they don't see it as a real world thing. But you know, we also have to examine about, you know, when parents start to ask us about, you know, the impact between playing these games and violence. I've had parents who've asked me, you know, worried about concerns about their 10-year-old being violent after playing Call of Duty, at the same time telling me that they queued at midnight to get it at release, to buy it for them so they could go home and play at 1 a.m. And it's very difficult to answer that, you know, the concerns with a straight face, going, it's 18s, you know, would you let them into a movie theater to watch an 18s movie? No, not a bit. So those classifications are there, as you said, Chris, and people need to pay attention to them, and they're there to guide. And if you choose to bypass those guides, then it's very difficult to come back after the fact and say, I'm worried that, you know, it had a negative impact on them.
Yeah, it's all about, I mean, informed decisions. And, you know, on the other hand, you know, in some cases, parents might say, "Well, I've seen the movie, I played the game, I'm pretty comfortable with it, even if it is." I actually have an amusing story of trying to take my son to see World War Z in the UK, which maybe if we have time, I'll share it. But it's interesting the sort of legal and societal differences between the UK and the US in regards to you know, some of those things. But as one more follow-up, Athira asked about the potential differences in effect size between television versus video game violence. That's a tough one to answer, because video game violence research has gone through an unprecedented level of scrubbing that television violence research never did. And what I mean by that is, like, if you think in terms of like psychology's replication crisis, video game violence research got slammed by it. And nobody's gone back to see if it applies to television violence research. So we actually, myself and a couple Australian researchers, have a meta-analysis of longitudinal studies on video game violence that's in press right now. So it's going to come out in the next few months, I think. That's essentially, we find that the effect size for video game violence on aggression in longitudinal studies is statistically no different from zero, basically. So if you look at it that way, the effect size is bigger for television, but that's only because I think people haven't gone back and looked for all the methodological issues and publication bias and other issues that probably inflated the effect size for television violence. My impression is there's really not great evidence that there's a sort of systematic effect for either form of television, movies, video games, in terms of impacting aggression. So I want to get to, there's more questions coming in. Before I do that, I do want to ask about Animal Crossing. So,
wait, what?
You're up, Rachel.
Yes.
I do want to get this one in. Well, so my question is, so yeah, it seemed like back to COVID, we're getting away from COVID into like video game violence, which is great. We can talk about whatever we want. So like Animal Crossing became like the mascot of COVID-19. And I've never played it, I'll be honest with you. And I still don't want to. So I'm curious, what is it about Animal Crossing that is like, why did this?
So many things. I'm going to give the TLDR. It's cute. It's accessible. You can pick it up. You can put it down. It gives you a sense of routine. It follows the clock of your day and your time zones. If you get it on 8, it's 8 in the morning. If you get it at night, it's night in the game. And going back to what we were talking about, SDT, autonomy, competence, and control, and self-determination theory. Those 3 things are largely missing in the times of COVID-19 in our day-to-day lives. We don't have control over what's happening around us. Where our social relationships have significantly changed. Our sense of competency maybe is reduced in terms of being able to be a parent and work and do all the things you have to do. And you can achieve those things in Animal Crossing fairly easily. You log in, you catch a fish, feel like you're accomplished, you know. I just love the game so much. It brings together generations. My 5-year-old plays, I play, my grandma can play. And it's one of those things that doesn't take a lot of investment to learn. You can just pick it up and all of a sudden you're running around on your little beach. And I've done more interviews about Animal Crossing than any game ever. And I've been in this field for more than 10 years. So now I just feel like I have to talk about it because it's all anybody wants to talk about.
Uh-oh, we lost Mark somehow in there. He's not an Animal Crossing fan. He
went to go play. I inspired him. Yeah, there he is.
Yeah. We thought we'd cross the line with you there, Mark. Like, no, you got video game violence, R-rated movies, Animal Crossing, totally verboten. We're not going to talk about that. That's
technology issues. Right on.
Any other thoughts about Animal Crossing? Is that like, I'm actually curious, like of the attendees, how many people here are like Animal? I wish I could see like a show of hands or something like that of like Animal Crossing fans or whatever. I've like literally never set foot in Animal Crossing worlds at all.
Well, there's a lot of people streaming it on Twitch if you want to, like a lot.
Well, I've never been on Twitch either.
Oh, no.
I'm showing my limit.
Get with the kids,
old.
Chris.
Yes. I'm way older than I look, so which I guess is a good thing. But anyway, all right. So somebody asked, Brooke Criswell asked, when do you think VR will be more accessible? That's a great question. What do you all think? Is this going to be the wave of the future or?
Oculus is pretty accessible. I feel like there's an Oculus package that starts at like $100, right? That you can, I don't know that much about VR, but I know there's multiple tiers of Oculus Rift that you can buy, and from like super professional to $100 or less. So I feel like every day, like at PAX, every year at PAX, there are more and more VR applications of games that are coming out.
Other folks, panelists?
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to just costs and availability. In terms of mass production, the more produced, the more it'll come down and make it more accessible.
Yeah, some of them are really beautiful. Beat Saber, super fun. Anybody's played that?
Resident Evil 7 in VR. Highly recommend.
Thank you. On your own.
Yeah, highly recommend if you want a horror experience. It's really good. Yeah, I think there's also the issue of you need to get so many people to buy it before people will make product for it, but people won't make product for it until people buy it. So it's kind of like that kind of like feedback loop. Eventually the snowball will take off and you'll get it. But I mean, it's available. I mean, I got it for the lab with the PlayStation 4. It's kind of cool. Plan to get it with the PlayStation 5. I think they're still going to keep the VR working. So it's pretty neat. Looks like I'm a horrible human being, and I skipped over someone's question from Derek. She actually was, or he was, excuse me, complimenting your book, Rachel. First of all, he said that your book, Guide for Parents, is useful and helpful. And what guides what do you think? I guess I'm trying to interpret his question here, so Derek could yell at me if I got it wrong. What guides should we give to the media? So what should we be asking the media in terms of what they should be saying about video games? I'm hoping I'm answering this question.
They should be consulting researchers instead of fueling the moral panic.
Okay. All right. So
That's my
I agree, but the problem is it doesn't sell newspapers. You know, to get a front page headline, tiny correlation between video gaming and it just doesn't sell papers. It doesn't get clickbait. And you know, we've seen it, Chris, in a thing that we did together about screen time and kids' development and developmental ages, where it had a minuscule correlation size, but nobody's interested in that because they want the effect, because it fuels the panic. It gets people engaged. It gets them morally outraged. Whereas correlation doesn't equal causation, just doesn't pull people in as a headline.
Yeah.
Although I have got to say, you know, over the last few years, I have worked quite well with a number of journalists who are actually very responsible reporters and do take time to get the full story, to do proper investigative pieces, and I think it's, you know, when working in partnership, I've found does work well, and they are wanting to provide responsible reporting, and there are good reporters out there, and I think it's finding that there's good few, or maybe more than few, who are willing to listen and to get the ball rolling in that way. So I never like to kind of put a big, you know, blanket a generalization that all the media are bad, because there are some really good reporters, and I've certainly worked with quite a lot. So yes, that partnership, I think, is a way to go and make sure the evidence informed narrative gets out there.
And I would agree, and that is coming from a point of view of getting burned by one particular red top, and that was my own fault for going there in the first place. But I think there's just certain media outlets that I just won't go near, because I know they have a very fixed narrative. That's a very black and white view that no matter what you say is going to get sensationalized or turned. So it's about finding those journalists, like you said, that you can trust, that will relay the content in a reasonable and evidence-based way, and just keep promoting it through them.
I think, you know, for any attendees who become journalists or do science journalism in any form, the other thing is to be wary of sort of like conflict of interest sources a little bit. That I see a lot of like gaming disorder clinics use as experts, you know, and they say like gaming is like heroin and stuff like that. It's like, well, they have a financial, you know, stake in the game too, because, you know, and it's not that they shouldn't be part of the narrative. They shouldn't be, you know, queried by news reporters, but you might want to balance that off with people that have a bit less of a pretty obvious financial stake in a particular issue as well. There's one particular clinic in the US that always ends up in the news, and I always like, oh yeah, that's fine, you can interview them, but you might also want to balance that, you know, so we're not always getting these video games are just like heroin sort of headlines that we sometimes get. Video games are not like heroin.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah, that wasn't, they may have issues, but they are not like heroin.
I had a particularly rigorous debate with a guy from the UK who runs one of those clinics, who in a media interview told me that letting your child upstairs to play a game is the same as giving them a bottle of vodka and heading up on their own. So I might have challenged that just a little bit.
Yeah, that doesn't help people.
No, it isn't. It's totally unhelpful advice to give.
Yeah. All right, so we have a question from Nick Bowman.
Hey, hi Nick.
A lot of us know Nick. So extending that question, I no longer know what question that was. That he was extending. This is like from a half hour ago. What have we done as psychologists to better understand how players construe and make sense of content? I feel like we focus so much on outcomes that we rarely study the actual meaning making in our popular game studies work. Is that a fair critique? That's a great question. So what do y'all?
Yes, that's a fair critique, I would say.
That's a very, very good observation. And I think this is the case actually for a lot of technology use studies across sort of cyber psychology more generally. This is something I've had discussions with numerous people with, and yeah, the typical paradigms in psychology are let's focus on the impacts and the effects, but we don't know quite as much about what are the uses, what are the ways we're engaging, what are the kind of the whys, the what's, the hows, rather than just what the effects are. So you know, I think it's a prevalent issue across a lot of different psychology, looking at technology, not just games. So actually, I think the thing is, I think there's a lot of human computer interaction work that tells us a lot about the things that you mentioned, Nick, but I think psychology as a discipline probably doesn't know as much as we should do.
Yeah, I think in particular what I'd like to see a lot more research about, and maybe it might come out of COVID, is about the meaning for young people between the interactive piece. So the difference between maybe something, I don't know, maybe it has been done, but a study of people who prefer to play single player versus those who like to play cooperative games where they chat and they talk, and the meaning for them and the importance of them, of playing within clans, that sense of collective identity or the ability to communicate and to feel connected to others. I'd be really interested to see if that, but I'm very reliant on my academic colleagues to go off and do those studies for me.
There's a related question from Jan Leroux, who a few of us know as well. Kind of picking off on what Nick was saying. Most of our theories on video games were produced in the 20th century and are media-centered. Isn't it time to develop theories that focus on people and communities? I think that kind of goes along with a lot of what we were just saying. I think probably most of us would agree, yes, maybe?
Yeah,
Or
especially communities, and Linda's doing some of that work for sure. Yeah.
I think, you know, there is this sort of sense of like, I'm trying to think, it should be called like I think hypodermic needle model or something of that sort, like this idea that like media is injected into people, you know, and that's that kind of 20th century view, which which is also predominant in like social psychology, right? So they don't really use that term anymore. Sort of like the social cognitive models of like aggression and things like that tend to be kind of hypodermic needle. They might not like that I said that, but they are, you know, and you know, kids don't just suddenly like wake up and all of a sudden Call of Duty is playing in front of them, right? You know, so it's not like random that people end up getting exposed to what they do. So this sort of interest to me in like, why are people motivated, you know, to approach one form of media versus another one, and how does that? So we're getting back to self-determination theory here. Andy's really proud.
And as parents, I mean, if we want to just pivot slightly, you're responsible for controlling that, talking about looking at age ratings and stuff. Like I have a 5-year-old, almost 6-year-old daughter who loves Minecraft and asks me for Roblox every day, which she will not get because she's 5. So if you're concerned about the impact that games have, you can control by looking at what the ratings are. You can sit and watch your children play games with you to actually get a firsthand content of what it is. You can find out what Twitch is, and you can watch somebody else playing it and get a sense of what the content is. So there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of keeping control, or at least one eye on the kind of media that's being consumed by the people in your house.
Yeah, I think, you know, sorry, go on, Mark.
I was going to say my 7-year-old had been pestering me for ages for Minecraft, and eventually went, okay, we're going to do that. It was interesting. His very first reaction was, can he add one of his friends so that they could play it together? So immediately he wanted that sense of social connection. I was like, yeah, of course you can, but you're not anyone else unless I know them. So again, it's yes, but. Yes. So yes, we can get involved, but we will still have kind of boundaries, and we can appreciate the meaning for them in wanting to, because it's not just the game that they play it, it's when they meet or they're in the schoolyard afterwards to talk about it and to reflect on it. And here's what I did, and here's how I problem solved that level. So that it's still a source of communication for them, like somebody else might talk about, here's what I found in the latest shops, or here's the new top that I found. You know, it's what they're interested in.
Yeah, I think the point I was going to say was going back to the original question is the sort of 20th century model versus the sort of 21st century model. And I think that is a really good observation. And actually, if we think about what 21st century skills are, you know, collaboration, and that is one of those. And actually games are so well suited to that. So moving beyond that sort of dose response kind of model, and that Chris was talking about, actually it is actually very relevant to the way we kind of conceptualize, you know, society now. So actually I think that's a really good observation.
All right, cool. I want to make sure to take a few minutes to talk about the World Health Organization. It got brought up, I think, by Mark and by Pete. So the theme is going to be what the hell's going on with the WHO. But there are two threads of this, in my opinion. One is, I think, again, either Mark or Pete mentioned that they have this gaming disorder diagnosis, but then during the pandemic seemed to release or get involved with, at least with some narratives that were encouraging people to play more video games. So there's that kind of, maybe it's not incongruous, but I think some people perceived it as being incongruous to some extent. And then there was also, during COVID, particularly the early stages, there were critiques of the WHO as being too friendly to China, I think was kind of the narrative. Essentially, they were repeating things about COVID-19 back in like January, February, that were sort of repeating China's, oh, it's no big deal kind of line, and then get critiqued for that, which is interesting because the WHO have also been, well, they actually kind of admitted that they were under pressure from, their word was Asian countries, to produce the gaming disorder diagnosis. And most people think that probably means China, possibly South Korea. Is there like a core, so I guess putting those two things together, like what's going on? What do you make of the WHO gaming disorder, China? Is it all a big conspiracy? I mean, I'm being facetious a little bit here, but is it one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing? I mean, what's going on?
I don't
Okay,
know.
I'll
Go ahead, Mark.
where do you even start with all of that, Chris?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that the WHO and certainly local health authorities have been trying to do throughout this is be consistent with their message, because they need to be, because you need to repeat the message over and over again for it to make sense to people and for it to incorporate it. But I think their stance on gaming did the opposite of what they were trying to do with this. And for me, it was almost like, oh, actually, maybe it's not as bad anymore because there's something worse out there that'll kill you. So, we'll relax our stance on that because something bigger has come along that actually you need to be more scared of this. So yeah, you play away because, it might reduce your isolation and everything. But I think, and I've worked with you on this before, Chris, on a paper that, and I think like many diagnoses in particular in DSM-5, it's scant on objective evidence to justify its inclusion. And in my clinical work, I see young people who do engage in problematic gaming, but they're also extremely anxious or extremely depressed, and this is their coping mechanism. So if you come in and the advice is, take away the computer because it's the cause of it, you take away everything away from their only coping mechanism, what have they got left? I think there's enough stigma attached to mental health that throwing an additional label on is not necessarily helpful to their self-esteem either. And it's also, from a young person's perspective, incredibly invalidating to, they're coming to a mental health clinic and you're very depressed, perhaps suicidal and really anxious. And the entire conclusion that the therapist comes to is you game too much. It's just really invalidating experience to restrict their life experiences and maybe some of the trauma and the difficulties of experience down to gaming. So I think we don't need this diagnosis to be able to help young people to develop other more positive ways of coping.
Yeah, I agree. And the point that you make there is the one that I always get on my soapbox on, which is the game isn't itself the problem. No research has shown me that the game itself is the problem, but it's something else underlying. And if you're saying the game is the problem, you're not treating the depression, you're not treating the anxiety, you're just taking the games away, which I think is also terrible.
All right. So moving on to a question from Ann Townsend. She asks, a panel of writers for television and streaming said the majority of highly morally objectionable speech and actions make people think about the moral involved. Another panelist brought up All in the Family, which, if you are not familiar with that, across the pond, it was a American show that had from the 70s, I think, that had a racist protagonist. It was a comedy, but like on purpose had like this like very prejudiced, bigoted,
Sexist, misogynistic.
Yeah, everything
ever on television.
But they did it on purpose. Like it was intentionally that way. Then age-related moral values, generational, came into play, where men older than 60s agreed with the male protagonist's racist and bigoted points of view. So I think she's asking, what is the impact of media portraying racism, sexism, other bigotry? Does that have different impacts on people of different generations? In other words, are older people who may not be as enlightened, I guess is what we're assuming, are they going to have a different reaction to that media? Is it going to reinforce their various prejudices, whereas younger people may respond to it very differently and cause them to challenge it? I think, again, I'm trying to hopefully fairly interpret the question.
Yeah, I think you do see, as time changes, attitudes change. I mean, I think the recent case of Faulty Towers, and again, for our colleagues over the pond who aren't aware of that, it's a British comedy which was in the 70s, and there was some, you know, quite racist, what we deemed to be quite racist terminology in there, and it was banned quite recently and then reinstated. But, you know, looking back on it now, you do sort of watch it and think, oh, that's a bit dodgy. But I don't know if it's a generational thing or just a time changing thing, and values changing, and then they will transpire into generational differences because of that. But I do think you do see those attitudes change. Whether that has impacts on people's behaviours, I'm not sure. I guess so. I guess we do see differences over time.
Okay. All right. Very good. I'm going to be a little bit naughty, and I'm going to try to make sure to get people who at least I'm identifying as having asked questions for the first time. I know, Nick, you had a second question, and I'm apologizing. I'm skipping past yours to get to someone else because we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, I'm afraid. Unless we can stay here for another few hours, it would be fun. I think we get a lot of questions. It's great. I appreciate all the interest. This is fantastic. I was afraid of having like no questions and like us thinking like, well, what's your favorite game? You know, doing that a lot.
So Chris, this is Jerry Lynn. I just wanted to let you know that we are capturing all of these, and we might bring this up in one of our networking sessions or in some other virtual format. But we are capturing all the questions so that you can answer them offline maybe in the future.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, I feel bad leaving people hanging here, but all right. The next question is by Kayla Hip. In that case, is there any evidence of gender differences in the effects of video games? For example, do females benefit more than males from video game socialization, or vice versa? Does the societal idea that girls shouldn't be gamers impact their mental health, etc., while playing games? That's a great question.
The second one for sure, in terms of the way they're treated by the rest of the community. There tends to be, not everyone, there are some bad eggs in every basket, but there are a lot of female players, and there's work coming out of Ohio State University from Jesse Fox talking a lot about this, about how they can't communicate with voice over communication, or they don't reveal that they're female because they are treated differently, and in a lot of cases negatively, by other members of the gaming community that aren't female. I don't know about the first question, though. I don't know if you can speak to that, Linda, about gender differences and the way it affects.
I think it depends what kind of effects that you're thinking about in terms of games. Overall, not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think when you look at things like aggressive outcomes, you tend to find males tend to be more aggressive anyway, not necessarily as a result of games, but just in general tendencies. But I don't know is the short answer to that.
Me either, so we're on the same page.
I don't know the answer either, which is 3, but I think on the first piece, I tend to agree with Rachel. I see that in kind of the therapy rooms with the young people, the young girls who are gamers, they're very reluctant to admit it because from their point of view, they feel it doesn't fit with gender stereotypes of, you know, and they're kind of worried about the kind of mean girls phenomenon, that this doesn't fit with societally who I'm supposed to be. And they worry, and I think it's a reality that they could get bullied because of it. So they do tend to kind of stick to themselves, not talk much about it, which I think is sad that we are still living with that those gender stereotypes, that it can't just be something that any gender can enjoy and should enjoy.
Well, I never understood it, even from a self-serving perspective, in terms of, you know, I don't know, maybe Rachel, you know better than I do. I don't know what proportion of males are harassing females in games necessarily. If it's like optimistically, is it like a small group of jerks, you know, or is it like a widespread problem?
Yeah, it's not everyone. It's more than a few. I mean, I can't give like a specific number, but in terms of gender socialization, John Cherry wrote a lot about this, about how females are socialized to already feel like games are not for them, and then they are in there. Then you have the social identity aspect of games are for white heterosexual males, and if you're in my space, this is my space, and you're invading it, so then they react negatively to the females in the space. There's websites like notinthekitchenanymore.com, I think is one, where it specifically comments in games that females have received, and they are shocking. I will warn you now, they're graphic and terrible. And I haven't really seen any of this change so much over time, the toxicity towards female gamers specifically. So again, Jesse Fox and John Cherry are the people who do that work.
So I'm going to virtue signal for a second and say, like, I don't like this. This is so perplexing to me. It's so stupid. like not just from a moral perspective, but from a purely practical perspective, right? In the sense of like meeting partners, like the best way to meet partners is in shared activities. So as male gamers, why would you want to discourage girls or
Well,
women?
it's social identity. It's social. It's my. This is in group, out group. This is my group, and you're not part of it. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
I just find like that would be like a message, like a practice. You could meet more women this way if you just sort of like less of an asshole, you know, in this space. I don't know. I mean, if we can't appeal to people morally, like this is the right thing to do, then maybe the practical message is. I don't know.
It's a new campaign that we need to try
No,
to reduce toxicity.
I think it comes through with certainly with teenage girls that I talk to, that they do see the practical element of that they see that it actually provides them an opportunity. So if they've got quite low self-esteem, they don't believe in themselves, that they're not pretty enough or attractive enough. And, you know, I wouldn't know how to talk to a boy. And through playing games, they find a mutual communication that suddenly actually boys are accessible again. So for me, they found that as a positive. But again, it's their female peers that they're wary of judgment from.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So
that is interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. So do we have time for one more question, Jerry Lynn, or are we getting scarce here?
You're doing good. You have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Okay, so quick 30-second answer to this one. Let's see. To what extent is the view of gaming related to perceptions of rap music? There seems to be a similar discussion around both aggression and violence. Rap is now more accepted too. There may be racial connotations here as well. Okay, that's fascinating set of questions there. What do you think? Quick 1 minute answer from three panelists.
I don't know. I feel like there is a paper on this, like in my mind, there's like a spark, a small one being like, I feel like somebody has talked about rap music specifically in games, but I can't get it out.
Well, I think he's saying, is there a parallel to like maybe putting words in this is excuse me, this I didn't think of Regina Tuma, I think it's her name. So I think she's asking, is there a parallel between the moral panic and again, maybe that's not her word, that's mine, over rap music?
There's a parallel across all moral panics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Fear of the unknown, fear of something new.
Yeah. If I can, Chris, I want to be really, really bold. And there was a question there from Nick Bowman that kind of piqued my interest. I think he said he wasn't out of 2, but I'm going to jump in and answer it, because there have been themes sometimes in the discussion around parents and parents kind of not getting involved and parents not looking at the age rating. But Nick had mentioned a point around kind of expectations of parents and having to be a perfect parent. I think it's a really good one, that parents are under a lot of pressure, that when, you know, kids are, well, my best friend has this game, can I have it too? And they don't want their kids to be distressed. They don't want them to be left out, the only kid on the block who doesn't have the game. And that's a really tough place for a parent to be in. So even though, yes, we would want them to get more involved and to maintain the boundaries, we do have to know that it's not easy to say no. And especially when they're upset, they're crying, they're giving you the big puppy dog eyes, and you know you don't want to do it as a parent, but you know you don't want to make them sad either. And that, you know, I do have a lot of empathy for parents who are in that position. It's not an easy decision to make.
Yeah, fair enough. And Regina did ask about like the racial connotations to some of this stuff. The one thing that sort of piqued in my mind when she asked that, there's a study by Patrick Markey and Jimmy Ivory, and I think a few other people are on there too, and I can't remember who, that looked at sort of like when video games are used as a rationalization for like mass shootings or other acts of violence. And they found that when the perpetrator is white, video games get blamed a lot more than if the perpetrator was black, for instance, which suggests, I think, kind of as maybe Regina is hinting towards, that oftentimes video games are used in the sort of racial context, right? That, you know, if there's an assumption about who does or doesn't commit acts of violence, that itself is prejudicial, bigoted, you know, whatever. And then there's a crime that doesn't fit that narrative, then people may be more likely to look for excuses to sort of, you know, I don't know, whether it be cognitive dissonance or something of that sort, to explain why the data doesn't fit the you know, in other words, if I guess basically put it bluntly, like if a white kid from a suburb commits a mass shooting, well, it must have been video games that did it to him or something of that sort. And that, I think, does reflect, but in my mind, it does reflect some racial prejudice, you know, in that situation. So, you know, that made me think of that.
Well, I'd really like to thank. Yes, you're doing the hook. Yeah, but this has been a great conversation, and I look forward to extending it in a variety of different ways. But I really want to thank you. I found it fascinating, and you opened the door to a lot of the video game research and video games during pandemic, and what possibly we can look forward to video games in the post-pandemic. I do want to let everybody on here know that there's now a break from 10:45 to 11:15 a.m. Pacific time. Do your own math and conversion to your time zone that you're in right now. And a reminder that at 11:15 a.m. Pacific, there'll be 2 panels. The first one in room 1 will be the panelist will introduce the new American Psychological Association's journal on technology, mind, and behavior, which I know is very close to a lot of us on here that are members of the American Psychological Association Media Psychology. I think we're thinking that's going to be our new go-to journal. And then also in room 2, we have 4 authors for the upcoming monograph on real characters, where they'll be discussing parasocial relationships. So right now, half an hour break, use it to go see the pre-recorded talks that we have and the posters. Where, depending on your time zone, go grab a coffee or what have you, and meet you in one of those rooms in half an hour. And thanks again to this amazing panel. Really enjoyed the discussion.